Everyone watched in silence as the shadow soldier disappeared. A little while later, a hunter started coming out of that cave, and the helicopter that had come to join them started hovering above them. Those on the helicopter noticed that the hunters were coming towards them. Jin-Woo started to tell them to go without him as he had unfinished business here. The head of the White Tiger realized that the battle wasn't over yet. Jin-Woo started to say that he would go and clear the way, deal with the remaining ants, and at that moment he summoned his shadow dragon, Kaisel. As soon as he sat on it, he said to the head of the White Tiger, "See you later," and he began to fly up into the air, and his huge wings began to slash in the air, those ants that came in his way. At this time, on one of the cruisers, sat the hunters who were from the Japanese Association. One of the hunters kept saying that this monster is a real terror, and they just haven't seen him. Therefore, they can't realize how terrifying he is. Their leader, Ruji, was killed in such a brutal way. He starts saying that they can't defeat him, and this raid is doomed to fail. The hunter who was destroying that monster didn't have time to finish his sentence. At this time, another man standing above him started to tell him not to worry. That hunter thought it was a lie, but it was the official information they had just received from the Korean headquarters. And that man began to reflect that it seems that Korea also has a rather capable hunter. However, he's probably weaker than Goto-san. But suddenly the staff started saying that the ants were running away, and the cruisers started making preparations. But at this time, the battle continued on the island, and Jinwoo continued to exterminate all the ants. He began to realize that once he destroyed the ants that hadn't hatched yet, he could gain some experience. This was incredible luck, and when he called up his inventory, he saw that he could restore order with the sword he had gotten when he passed the demonic castle. He started pulling this sword out of his inventory, and as soon as he saw it, he realized that he had completely forgotten about it. He then began to look at its functionality, swung the sword, and a huge electric wave began to cut everything around him. He marveled at how powerful this sword was and couldn't understand how he could have forgotten it existed in his inventory. Still, he decided to deal with the remaining eggs with this tool. On another continent, the director of the Hunter Management Bureau was watching a tape on television and realized that while they were watching the broadcast, morning had imperceptibly come. He started talking to the man who had barged in on him at such a late hour. A hunter who can summon hundreds of souls is actually a very talented guy. Not taking advantage of his abilities within South Korea is a big miss. The other man was also in agreement with this. In addition, he had heard about a high-profile case that happened a few months ago in the Hunter Management Bureau. This case is known as the Sunel Hwan case. This is the same prisoner that Hunter James captured when he was cleaning up the orange dungeon that emerged in the east of America. They didn't really know whether he was a monster or a human. However, he claimed to be a Korean hunter. Fortunately, all the information was kept in the bureau, and the investigation revealed that the man was Sun Jin's father. In other countries, they don't even know who Jinwoo is, so they should take advantage of this. And the case of Hangdong is a different story. After all, Korea is their ally. However, if they appropriate two S-ranked hunters at once, it might seem as if they decided to turn their backs on them. The other man started to say that if he could arrange it, it would be fine. However, at this time, Jinwoo's level was raised, and thus he had reached the 100th level. As soon as he approached that ant, he realized that there was a rather powerful aura coming from that guy and ordered him to arise. But suddenly nothing happened, and darkness started appearing everywhere. He didn't start feeling anything because he had used the shadow extraction skill on himself. Everything suddenly went dark, and he realized that he had failed. But suddenly the shadow returned, and he appeared behind him at the same moment. The notification system showed that he had successfully retrieved Jinwoo's shadow, rejoicing because he thought he had already failed. A terrifying shadow soldier stood in front of him, and the general was beside him. Jinwoo, looking at his new shadow soldier, realized that a new era had opened up. An ordinary elite knight no longer means the next one, here comes the general, and it turns out he's a head above the rest of the soldiers. Not surprising, though, since his abilities are incredible. And now it was the queen's turn to rebel. But suddenly the shadow ant started talking and addressed Jinwoo with the words, "Lord," for the master to give him a name. And Jinwoo realized that he too had contracted the absolute loyalty syndrome, like all shadow warriors. He wondered how he learned to talk, but he replied that he already knew how to do it, And then Jinwoo realized that he knew how to talk because he originally had the ability. But that was not the point. After all, Iron was a human just like Hunter Man Ben and Fong, and it was all about rank, not the impossibilities. Jinwoo pondered what will happen if the others increase their rank. Will I be able to talk to them too? He started to talk to the ant about killing him, and still the ant wants to obediently follow him. But the ant replied that he was not killed but resurrected by the king's power, and now his soul is overflowing with joy. Henceforth he would follow only his king forever. He bowed once more and asked the king to give him a name, for Jinwoo hesitated for a moment. After all, if he just called him Ant or Ant, it wouldn't be very good. He started to think of a name for him, and then the name of a writer who became famous for his novel Ant came to his mind. He remembered him and gave him the name Baru, and as soon as he got his name, he thanked the Lord. But now Jinwoo needed to awaken the queen's soul, and once the queen's soul started to rise, he saw that she also had the rank of a general. But suddenly, all the ants started acting strange somehow. After all, they were somehow connected to the ants, and suddenly that connection weakened. He started to ask Baru what happened, but the latter told him that controlling the legion of ants was an ability, and as long as she was alive, then the reins would pass to her. Jinwoo realized that despite her rank, he wouldn't say that the queen had a lot of mana. He wondered what that was due to, but Baru started to say that most of her mana was for reproduction, and since it was impossible to lay eggs without a physical body, in other words, the queen was unfit for battle. Jinwoo realized that one leader would be enough for him, so he canceled that summoning. But suddenly he noticed his shadow soldiers starting to collect magic stones, and he ordered them to stop. After all, they should go to rebuild the island and pay compensation for the damage, and they shouldn't be touched because he had enough of this stone he had retrieved from Baru's corpse. In addition, they need to destroy the remaining ants. Jinwoo wondered if his combat power would improve to deal with everyone with his current strength, but suddenly Baru began to say that he felt that the enemies without a leader were in a predicament and unable to gather in military units. They had scattered into smaller groups. Jinwoo began to speak. Baru, can he figure out how many ants are left? The one began to explain that before the battle started, there were over 8,000. But now among the survivors, there were just over 4,000 left. But Jinwoo found that he had already wiped out many of them, but there were still quite a few left. So Jinwoo began to ask his general if he could deal with them, to which he replied, "If that's the order, I'll do it." At this time, one of the hunter ships saw the ants flying in their direction, and they began firing at them from the ship's cannons. The magic that was there also began to use its power and attack the ants. The hunters realized that the ants were flying north, and if they flew there, they would run into the camp. Now it was their time to prepare for battle. They saw a great many ants flying straight at them, and one of the hunters first says that Glory must also prove herself in this battle, and they must cut down everyone that catches their eye. But another hunter starts yelling, "What is he doing?" After all, each ant is comparable to a hunter in rank, and he might get hurt if he doesn't stick with the rest of the hunters. They all decided together to restore their reputation, but one of the hunters started to go crazy, for he felt incredibly powerful and didn't understand how they could fight them. But the other hunter noticed this and began to reflect on the fact that he seemed to be of high rank, but in reality, he was nobody. And once the ants had already started to reach the island, the hunters who were on the shore could not believe it. After all, they didn't know if they could beat them. All the hunters wanted to group together quickly, for the ants were coming faster and faster. But suddenly, a bright light appeared in the sky, and all the ants began to scatter into pieces. They saw that some creature had just killed the ants, and it was too fast. They didn't even have time to see it. They wondered what it really was. For 2 days now, the ants had been actively exterminated in the south of Korea. After that, they were discovered on the coast of the China Sea, and they had already reached China. The men who were on the ship began to discuss the fact that they had not been able to sleep a wink for 2 days. But at that time, another man began to say that the Second Legion had already entered the firing zone and started fighting. The Chinese hunter on board was already ready to show himself in all his glory. He saw that the ants were very numerous, and there was no end or edge. He began to draw his great swords and told them to submit in peace and let the sea be their grave. He used his skills by taking out his 2 large swords and used them to send 2 large magical waves towards the ants that flew at them. At that very moment, all the ants were destroyed. That hunter realized that they were just little things, pot-bellied, and so, if that ant that Jinwoo had fought had survived, it would have gotten really hot in here. but he realized that what's to come is what's to go. At the same time, in a house in America, a girl who went in to see the hunter asked how he thought that Jin-Woo and Mr. Hang had something in common, and perhaps Hang Dong-soo had killed Hunter soon. Specifically, therefore, his brother Mr. Wong would most likely take revenge. And as soon as someone wanted to tell the girl that he said all the right things, she agreed. Thomas Andre, who was the master of the scavenger guild, started to say that he had some kind of disorder because now it wouldn't be so easy to meet Jinwoo, and he was so eager to meet him. After all, the girl started to ask if he would give them the opportunity to fight, how he would do it. But Thomas started to answer her that it's not like they've known each other for days. And since Mr. Hang belongs to the Scavengers Guild, which is his guild, he doesn't forgive those who touch his property. Yeah, even if it's the US government itself. On the third day of the raid on the island, the military and the main forces of the Knights Guild landed to collect crystals and deal with contingencies. They were walking along the shore, and one of the hunters was talking about how there was one person in the world who almost never had any luck. However, this guy would not give up, as he really wanted to get a gold medal in hard training for perfect self-hardening and dropping down a weight class. He had endured it all. He only had to take one step towards his dream because it was literally in front of him. All he had to do was reach out. All doping tests showed a positive result, and the day before the momentous event, he even had a good night's sleep and felt just fine. However, due to the sudden awakening, magical powers appeared in him, as a result of which he was no longer able to participate in the Olympic Games. Another hunter who was walking behind realized that he was talking about himself and kept saying that this guy had to give up his screw, but he found a new dream, to start the best guild in the country. They finally found high-grade crystals and started saying that by collecting them, they could become the best in all of South Korea. The Korean girl who was standing behind them started to say that this was wrong. Next, they saw a lot of ants and realized that they seemed to have done a pretty good job here, and everything was clean. There were no traces of mana anymore. Suddenly, one of the hunters noticed an ant hiding behind a wall, and he didn't wait long. He started chopping it down with his big sword. As soon as he killed it, he started telling the guys not to worry because there might still be ants here, but they came here to eliminate them. Suddenly, one of the guards started calling out. He saw something. Suddenly, they saw some strange man heading straight towards them. They didn't realize that there was supposed to be no one on the island except the military and associations after getting them this assignment. The leader started telling that man to immediately confess who he was. He began to tell his companions not to shoot yet, for he did not look like a monster. And he began to tell the man that he was in forbidden territory, and if he followed their instructions, and if he resisted, they would open fire. But the man began to speak in some incomprehensible language, and the hunters realized that it was the language of monsters. But suddenly, some other creature snapped its fingers, and this made all the hunters start to faint and fall to the ground. That man who suddenly appeared began to ask the other one what kind of trick it was, but the one answered him that it was unnecessary and they had nothing to do with it. The hype just put them to sleep for a short time. He started asking his comrade if he had checked everything, and the latter replied that yes, that was what was strange. They started to say why he was even helping people in the first place, but the other replied that he didn't understand the cockroaches in his head either. They noticed ants that were lying on the ground, and they began to get sick of the rotting insects. But suddenly, one of those men began to say that it was time to start the hunt they had planned and stick to the basic plan. That man opened a portal in front of him and began to walk into it. The other man told him that one of the people they were hunting was here in Korea. Since they are already here, they can straighten him out since he is nearby. But the other man began to say that they should entrust the matter to someone else. And as soon as one of the men started to go into the portal, the other man started telling him that he didn't want to mess with that man to get even, but another time. He told him lastly that it was okay to say that because in general, he could think as he wished. The portal closed, and that man who had stayed on the island began to say that he was a coward and began to look at the hunters who were lying under his feet for nothing. He swung his large hand, and some sort of portal opened in front of him, into which he entered and disappeared. A little later, reporters took pictures of Jinwoo going in to say goodbye to the dead, who died on that island when the raid ended. The whole world began to discuss the event vigorously, and it was his first assignment after he obtained the S rank. Some opinions hardly changed even after his debut, and everyone's interest was fueled by the talk of the raid. This was the reason why Jinwoo's name had become on the lips of almost everyone. As soon as Jinwoo started to leave, he met the head of White Corps, and the latter began to tell him that he always thought that the hero would not be able to end the war with his actions alone. However, after everything that had happened, he began to think that this was not the case, and he began to tell Jin-Woo to hold his head high, for he had put a stop to this tragedy. The head of White Corps thanked him in front of the people. As Jin-Woo stepped a little further away, he met his gaze with the huntress Chaw. She turned away with her gaze and blushed slightly. Jin-Woo didn't realize what had happened, but as soon as he looked at the pictures of the dead, he realized that the fifth raid on Jeju Island had a total of 4,800 participants, including hunters and ordinary awakened ones. 64 hunters and 32 citizens had died. It was a tragedy that ended in wasted sacrifices. However, this particular raid claimed fewer lives than the previous 4 attempts. A little later, Hunter Jin-Woo sat down at the table with the president of the association, and the latter began to tell him that it wasn't him in words who was planning to start his own guild. In that case, since he is a high-ranked hunter, he doesn't need to have his guild master's license with him at all. It would only be enough to make one call to the association, and they would handle it themselves. Jin-Woo thought that he needed to find out what other privileges high-rank hunters had. However, the president asked if he had accidentally set up barriers or something on the island, but Jin-Woo didn't know what he was talking about. The president went on to say that a small group of people had gone to the island to destroy the surviving ants and collect the crystals. However, they were found unconscious, and they were all hunters, both in ranks and guys from the Knights Guild. He started to ask if he could have put up a barrier and forgotten about it, but Jin-Woo told him that he had done no such thing. Jin-Woo wondered what these guys were saying, but the president replied that they didn't remember passing out, and they couldn't even tell if the technique belonged to magic or not. Jin-Woo thought about the fact that there might be some ant traps in there, but suddenly a man came up to the chairman and said something to him. The chairman started to tell him that it seems their guest had arrived earlier than he thought, and he needed to leave. Jin-Woo thanked him for his time. As soon as they left, Jin-Woo realized that he had to go as well. But just as he approached his car, some man approached him, apologized, and asked for his attention. He said hello and started by saying his name was Adam White, and he was a senior member of the American Bureau of Hunters. Jin-Woo could just call him Adam. He was in the office, but it turned out he wasn't easily caught off guard. He apologized for such an unexpected meeting in such a place, but Jin-Woo thought about what he said about looking for him in the office. If one thought about it like that, would it happen to be the foreigner that Ginho was talking about? Jin-Woo started to ask him what he wanted, but the man replied that he had information he wanted to share. It was possible that there was no other country or even organization he had received such information from, other than them. But Jin-Woo wondered, why would he want to give such information to him specifically? The man replied that it was because it was only for a select few who would benefit immensely. Actually, he had planned to meet him in person from the beginning, but the raid on the island was too impressive, or something else. Long story short, his deputy at the bureau wants to see him as well. I have an important case, he added, and he will tell him all the details by the deputy himself. He went on to say that there was a car waiting nearby and asked whether Jin-Woo would like to take a ride with them. But Jin-Woo started to say that he didn't know if he could trust them and he would think about it and call back. Finally, the man started to say that he had completely forgotten how important it is to keep the bar high during negotiations until the very end. Then the reward would be higher as well. He also clarified whether Hunter Jin-Woo knew about the ability of awakened ones to increase the abilities of other awakened ones. After saying that, Hunter Jin-Woo thought about it and soon agreed to go along with them. Michael Connor, the deputy bureau chief of the Hunter Bureau, arrived at the site by car and was excited to meet them. He began to say that he would be the interpreter, and once they were all seated, he would get right down to business and provide the hunter with documents to immigrate to the United States. He went on to say that it usually takes about 2 years to process such documents, but in a second, he would become a U.S. citizen himself. But Jinwoo was actually here for the information Adam had promised him. After all, awakening could help improve skills and increase abilities. He wondered, was such a thing really possible? The man began to say that honestly, such a person with such abilities was already here. He started saying to get the Selner girl in here, and after a few minutes, she started coming into the room. The man at the same time started saying that she was the only person in the world capable of helping awakened hunters overcome their limits. That was according to Selner's norm. But as Jinwoo looked at her, he noticed that she had a very different aura. She didn't look like the other awakened ones.